But we're here today worshiping Jesus. That's what we come to do. We come to worship Him, to allow Him to form us, to shape us, to help us understand who He is and who He has called us to be. And we worship Jesus with everything that we have. Worshiping Jesus is not just something we do with our minds. It's not just something we do because we sing a few songs and that's it. We worship Jesus with everything. But one of the things I'm wondering if in your walk with Jesus, if you do this, do you seek Jesus with curiosity? Now, I say curiosity, and I would say that in contrast to suspicion. There are people that seek Jesus with suspicion, trying to disprove Him, trying to show why He's wrong, why He's false, why He's not doing the things that He's supposed to, or making up those types of charges. But curiosity is in a sense of wonder, a sense of awe. It's really what it is. Curiosity, it says, Jesus, I haven't figured you out, but I have figured out that you are worth pursuing. That's what curiosity is doing. We're here today exploring Jesus. No matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you're not done. Some people are further along than others. But the fact of the matter is we're still seeking Jesus and still trying to understand who He is. And sometimes we come to realizations or conclusions in life without necessarily realizing it. And it just naturally happens. So when we come here today and when we're worshiping Jesus, we're being formed and shaped by Him, we're entering into these practices that are forming us to the people that we are today. So the things you've been doing in the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years influences who you are today. But again, sometimes we don't even recognize it. It reminds me of my hometown, or it may be more applicable to your neighborhood. So I grew up in a town of 700 people. And I remember when Casey's came to town, at my senior year of high school, that was a big deal, right? All right, that's the kind of town I lived in. And so I grew up in a small town, a rural town, and I can't tell you the names of the streets, but I can tell you how to get around the town. And in fact, if you show me a map, that's not going to be super helpful. And so little things like we had 2 parks in town. One was called the Big Park. The other was called the Little Park. Right? That's what we did. Now, I think it used to be called the West Park because it was on the west side of town, and it's called the Millie Curtis Park. But like, if I was to tell you, hey, I'll meet you at the Big Park, and you didn't know where the Big Park was, you can't find that on a map. But anybody who lived in the area knew what we were talking about, knew what it was. And so I can tell you how to get places. I can tell you that and a classmate, Brian, who lived on the corner of the 4-way stop in town, and yes, there was one 4-way stop. Who didn't? And that Kevin lived a few houses down until 3rd grade. When Kevin moved, you go to the last street in town and you turn left to the house that had the perpetual yard sale in which the people put their kids through college through having yard sale all year round. And you go to the end of the street, and that's where Kevin lives. Right? That's how I know the town. And so the reality is, I can kind of give you directions, but it's not going to be very clear. If I say things like go to the Big Park, what does that mean? Now, it's a small town. You drive around, you're going to find the park. It's not a big deal, right? But the fact of the matter is, but I can go show you. I can go show you those places. I can go show you where the best artesian well in town was. I can show you where the best hill to go sledding on still is. And so I know it because I grew up there, because I walked the neighborhood. I was exposed to that. And so we're here being exposed to Jesus, being shaped by who Jesus is. See, our purpose here is not just to give information or be able to recite certain phrases. It's about being formed and shaped by Jesus. And by being exposed to Jesus, by living with Jesus, by walking with Jesus, by allowing Jesus to move in us, we gain understanding. Now, sometimes we can't fully articulate that, but we can show people. We may not be able to give people directions from a worldly sense, but we can say, come with me and I'll show you who Jesus is. But I think in order to do that, we have to explore Jesus with curiosity. What does that look like? How do we do that? And so as I was thinking about this, we're going to be in Luke chapter 2. We're going to talk about the shepherds today. And I came up with the phrase, inspect for Emmanuel with imagination. Come to Jesus with curiosity, with an open mind, say, Jesus, I haven't figured it out, but I have figured out that you are worth pursuing. I'm not 100% who you are, but I know that I need to serve and follow you. And so we come to Luke chapter 2, starting verse 8. And right before then, we see that the first 7 verses are Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem, making that journey, as difficult as it was, and that Jesus was born. And so we get to verse 8, and it says, that night shepherds were staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified. So as we think about the shepherds' setting in this moment, they were living their normal lives. They were doing nothing extraordinary. Now, I'm not saying they're always living with integrity. Maybe they were doing things they shouldn't have done. But they were doing their normal thing of guarding their sheep. And I say that because I think there are times where we long to have these extra special moments. We want our life to be adventurous, to be extraordinary, to be all these things that are really, really high and really unsustainable. But the shepherds were living their normal lives. And so what I'm saying, why I'm bringing that up, is we need to be faithful in the ordinary. Because God can break in even in the mundane, even in the times we don't understand. So we must be faithful in the ordinary. And God created us to work. He created you to use your gifts, your passions. He created you to use what you have for His purposes. So if you have a passion in this, use that passion. Pursue that passion and use it for Jesus. That is what He calls us to do. But we have to be faithful in the ordinary. Now, sometimes the ordinary can be brutal. And this brings to mind of when you learn a new skill. Now learning skills is something we all have to do, but it's really, really hard when we start. I remember taking a typing class. And not only was it really hard, it was really boring to begin with. Because you could just use the 4 ASDF. That's boring. I mean, after you spell dad and sad, I mean, what else are you going to type with that, right? But it's part of the principle, part of the process of learning, of growing. I remember when I first started driving. Now, growing up in a rural area, it was pretty easy. I could go out into the country and practice driving, and there I could literally see no cars. You live in even a town the size of Burlington is a little bit more difficult, but you get into a big city, and that's really nerve-wracking to be able to learn to drive in those types of settings. But also think of when you learn a new instrument. If you've had kids in the house learning a new instrument, depending on that instrument, it can be pretty brutal. If you have a child learning to play a violin, you better get some earplugs. There are very few sounds I get bothered by, but the violin can sometimes be one of those sounds. Or woodwinds, or just those types of instruments. It can be difficult. But we're all like that. No matter how old you get, when you try something new, you're not good at it to begin with. The problem is, as adults, we're not okay with not being good. Right? So we don't grow. We don't grow in those types of capacity. But when we start a new skill, it requires a ton of mental concentration. I remember when I was learning to type, the ASDF, even as boring as it was, it required a lot of concentration. And now that I know how to type well, I can just kind of go without really thinking. And that's what happens when we develop skills. That they take a lot of concentration at the beginning, but then as we build them, they become a natural part of who we are. Which is why we have to be careful how we are formed and how we are shaped. Because they will become a natural part of who we are. Those things that weren't that big a deal at the beginning, that maybe we're just trying, maybe we're just exploring, but eventually those becomes patterns and rituals in our lives that shape us. And so this is why we have to be careful of making sure we pursue the correct things, because automatic things can be acquired unintentionally. We can be shaped and formed unintentionally. But the shepherds were doing their normal thing, and the angels interrupted them, and God's glory broke in. I wish we could actually picture this, imagine this, experience this, because the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. That's a crazy picture in my mind. Now, they were doing their normal, the ordinary, but when God breaks into our lives, it changes things. Their lives were disrupted, and they could not be the same. So these automatic habits that they had were put on hold. They probably had a lot of routines that they were going through, a lot of things that they were doing as they were guarding their flocks of sheep, but God's glory broke in and it changed things. Now, I don't know how accurate this is, and I don't really know how to even verify it or how you would measure this, but there are some sociologists who claim that only 5% of our daily activity is conscious, intentional actions we choose. Everything else is part of our rituals, part of our patterns, part of our automatic habits that have been built throughout our lives. My point is that this shows why it's really, really important to make sure we have things where they should be. That if Jesus is the thing that we are trying to pursue, then that we need to not let anything else get in the way of that. We must be intentional. So when we inspect for Emmanuel with imagination, with this curiosity, with this wonder, we come back to the fact of we may not have figured Jesus out, but we figured out that he's worth pursuing, that he's worth seeking. And so when we do that, when we approach him with imagination and curiosity, it opens ourselves up to say, Jesus, how do I need to be changed? Jesus, how do you need to form and how do you need to shape me? Because when the angel broke in, when God's glory was there, the angel had a message. The angel told them, tried to reassure them and say, don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will bring great joy for all the people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You'll find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth, lying in a manger. So the angel starts by saying, don't fear, which, let's be honest, that's a pretty hard sell. I mean, if God's glory is breaking in, it's pretty intimidating. It's going to cause a fearful reaction. And sometimes it's easy to look at some of these experiences in Scripture and say, man, that would have been so awesome to be there. I wish I could have been there. I would have acted so differently than that person did. Maybe. Probably not. Maybe. But the fact of the matter is God's glory is intimidating. But what we have to do, I think, is we have to be very intentional, and we must eliminate the line between the sacred and the secular. Now I say that, I'm not trying to say we should make all the secular things holy. But think of if we're stereotypical, think of a mafia movie. There's a line, they don't say it as much as they used to, but there's a line that say, it's not personal, it's business. And so that gives the mob boss or whoever it is this kind of freedom to say, we have a past relationship. I'm going to ignore that because of these current circumstances. And so I'm going to separate these two worlds, and this is a business thing, and I'm not going to let it affect my personal life. A lot of times we do that with our faith. Well, it's not spiritual, it's personal. It's my life. It's not what Jesus. This is not about Jesus. It's about me. It's my job. It's my career. My finances. My spouse. My kids. My. It's about me, and we separate these things. But we are not. It's not how Jesus calls us to live. He doesn't call us to compartmentalize our faith. We can't blur those lines. So if we're doing this, we should be doing it for Jesus. If we're not doing it for Jesus, we shouldn't do it. That's what we have to avoid. Because if we separate these things, honestly, we're having bad eschatology, bad end time concepts. Because what it does is devaluing what we do. If I'm doing things and I can do things that aren't Jesus, what's the point? What eternal value does that have? It's just transactional. It's what do I get out of it, or what can somebody else get out of it? But if I'm doing it for Jesus, then it can have an eternal impact. Now, I don't want to be grandiose or anything and say be over the top that everything you do is just going to be this awesome, overwhelming thing. But if we do it for Jesus, that changes the meaning of it right now. If we don't do it for Jesus, it impacts the meaning as well. Because this is good news that the angel had. The angel had good news for all the people. Now, there are some in our world who claim that God is harsh or vindictive or have these unfair accusations that they put against God. But if we take the angel's message, we recognize that the angel's message is good news for all the people because the Savior, the one who's going to save people, the one who's going to redeem people, restore people, to reconcile people to God, has come. That is the purpose of Jesus. His purpose is not to come make us feel bad about ourselves. His purpose is not to condemn us. His purpose is to bring people back to God. And we as the church, the followers of Jesus, are called to join Jesus in that mission. But what we have to be careful of, the church has the message, we have the message, but we're also called to be the message. We're not limited just to have the message, we must be the message. We must be the people that are living in this redemptive work of Jesus Christ. If we're not, then people are going to look at us and say, what's the point? What is that? Why is that something we should pursue? But see, it comes back to me, to my neighborhood, or my hometown. I may not be able to articulate the street names or all these facts or all this stuff about the town. But the best thing I can do for you is say, let me show you. Let me take you there. Let's go explore this part. Let's go to this artesian well that's the best water that you've ever tasted. That's a source of pride in my hometown. The high school used to be called the Artesians. Like that was literally the mascot. And so Artie the Artesian was the mascot. But anyway, so that's a little something you didn't ask for today. But it's a little weird if I kept talking about these wells and explain it. But that's what we need to do with people in Jesus. Say, I can't explain Jesus to you 100%. I can tell you some facts about Jesus, but let me show you Jesus. Come experience Jesus with me. Because once you do, you're going to realize he is worth pursuing. So one of the general superintendents in the Church of the Nazarene, and we have 6 general superintendents. One of them is Scott Daniels. And he said, the call of the church is not to make the world a better place to live. The call is to become a community faithfully witnessing to and extending by faith the kind of life made possible only through the death and resurrection of God's Son. See that's the community that we are called to make and invite people to participate with us in this. And that community is kind of hard to articulate to the world. Hey, come live in this community. Sometimes it sounds cult-like. Sometimes it sounds like a commune. Sometimes it can sound boring. But just come experience it with me. So it's not about having the right words to say. It's about inviting people to participate with you. Because the Messiah is here. That's what we're celebrating at Christmas. Right? Remember the fact that Jesus is born. He came. God in flesh is with us. Redemption is coming. And so maybe sometimes we have a problem. It's almost a chicken and the egg problem. Which came first, the chicken and the egg? And some of you were posting that on Facebook. Yeah, and that was funny because I was planning this already. But which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And so the question of what I'm getting at is which comes first, correct doctrine or belief? Do people have to articulate who Jesus is before they can believe in Jesus? Or do they believe in Jesus and then begin to articulate who he is? Now, I think if the way I phrase it, most people say, well, we may know a few things about Jesus, but we believe in him, and then our doctrine is shaped, and our understanding of who he is shaped. Now, if you listen to the church podcast, the December 1st episode was Martin and Chessie Glendinning, and a great episode. And so she was born in Albania, and now they minister in Croatia. But she was telling a story. Before she came to know Jesus, she helped plant a church. She was out passing out flyers and inviting people to come to this church that was starting. Now, she was probably more irreligious at that point, but she would have claimed to be a Muslim. So she was somebody who was not a Christian helping start a church. We don't have to have it all figured out before we come to Jesus. We don't have to have all the answers before we can come to Jesus. But on the flip side, I think sometimes we think we have all the answers and we don't need Jesus. Or we have it all figured out, so Jesus is done with us. Neither one of those is true. See, so we need to approach Jesus with curiosity. We need with imagination and allow him to shape us. Because we think of the early church in the sense of before doctrines were articulated, people gathered for worship. People realized that Jesus was somebody worth following. So there were a lot of practices that were established even before Scripture was fully established. Now, the 66 books of the Bible that we have, the 39 Old Testament books, the 27 New Testament books, was first proposed in 387. So we're talking several hundred years that the church existed before it had this official book that we call sacred. And I believe this book is sacred. I believe the Bible is something that we must hold dear and believe. But it's not about knowing the right things first. It's about just exploring who Jesus is and allowing Jesus to shape us. Because before we were able to articulate who Jesus is, we're being formed by him. We're being shaped by him. And so as the angels give this message, they recognize that this is a powerful moment, an opportunity for the world. The angels know who Jesus is. And so after the angel gives this message, this angel is joined by a vast host of others. The armies of heaven, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased." So I'm not exactly sure what a vast host of others is, but it's a lot. It's not like it was just a quartet or something like that came out. I just get this impression that heaven was bursting at the seams. Heaven was so excited for what was happening that it couldn't contain itself. The angels could not contain themselves. Heaven is bursting, and they come and they praise God for what has happened and what is moving and what is going on. They were excited. Now, I think sometimes we have to come to grips with being formed by Jesus has different practices and routines than being formed in the worldly standpoint. And in the sense of sometimes there are a few things we do that are different or odd, or maybe we could even say weird from the worldly standpoint. I'm not familiar with too many other places, too many other types of organizations that they gather together and sing a lot of songs. Now, there are a few. Maybe karaoke night is one of those, but that's not usually an inspirational moment. That's usually a mocking type moment. But the fact of the matter is that's a practice the church does that is uncommon at best in the world. You know, how many times do you go to a place on a regular basis and they pass an offering plate? Now, you may go to a benefit or something to promote a specific cause, but that's not something we do on a regular basis. Or we pass these trays and take communion, and we take this little piece of bread and this cup of juice, and we drink it in remembrance of Jesus. Or we dunk ourselves in water. These are some odd practices that we do that are uncommon in the world, but they shape us to who Jesus is. And so I'm not saying, the point of being a follower of Jesus is not saying, how weird can we be? That's not the goal. But to recognize being normal according to the world is not the goal either. Jesus is calling us to be different, a peculiar people. But we come back to the angels, and sometimes I get overwhelmed thinking about the angels. They come and they sing these praises to God. They're continually in God's presence, and yet they keep praising God. Heaven is really difficult to conceptualize because we're going to be praising God continually. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around that, of how are we going to continually be motivated to do that? Won't we be bored? Won't there be monotony? Won't this get tiring? But the angels show us that it won't, that they're still excited about God. And we get to the end of Revelation 21 and 22, and it talks about this new heavens and new earth and the city, that the sun's not going to shine because God's glory is that bright. Those are some of the images that we have on who God is. God is that awesome. And so we approach Jesus with this imagination, with this curiosity, asking him to shape us, to form us. And in many ways, we're asking Jesus to form and shape us in a countercultural way. But in part, we are created to worship. You are created to worship God. Now, God didn't create you to worship him because he needed a morale boost. He didn't need a pat on the back. That's not why you were created to worship him. You were created to be in a relationship with him, and God is so great that we will want to do nothing else but worship him. Now, worship is more than just singing a song. That's part of it. And part of why we sing songs is because they speak to us in so many different ways. Songs are emotional. Now, even secular songs, you might have an emotional attachment to some of those songs. But songs are emotional. Now, songs encompass a big part of who we are. Right? We have the sounds, the hearing, the speaking. We have the sights of what's happening. We have the emotional feeling of what it looks like. Sometimes we have movements where we raise our hand or we sway or we clap. We do those things where we have more than just, I'm saying something. More than just writing a word down on a piece of paper. But songs also can spark our imagination. You know, we sing songs that God of wonder beyond our galaxy, and like who is this God? Who is this God worth seeking, worth pursuing? Songs also have theological impact, some greater than others, and some have a greater emotional connection than others. Some have a greater theological impact than others. It's not comparing the songs, but recognizing the all-encompassing nature of what music does for us. In fact, there are over 400 references in the Bible to singing. Now, you may be a terrible singer, but that does not disqualify you from worshiping. If you're a terrible singer, I'm not asking you to sing louder, though. Now, we can make a joyful noise. I'm not trying to stop anybody from singing loud or soft, but to recognize that singing is part of what we are called to. We're called to worship God. And God created music, he created audio, he created sound waves, he created all these things and how the audio frequencies work together. But one of the things worship does is it brings us back and it anchors us to who God is. It anchors us into what is true when we worship. Not just singing, but when we worship in all other areas, it brings us back to who God is. But sometimes that does require actions from us. Because when the angels returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. So they hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in the manger. Sometimes God calls us to go and to investigate, to seek him, to break from the normal, break from the ordinary, and go and say, who is this Jesus? Now, I use the words of ordinary and normal, but sometimes it can just be the familiar. It can be the the routines that we've established the last year or two, the routines that we've established the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades of, do I need to break from this and explore who Jesus is? Because Jesus is worth exploring. I have no question about that. And if we seek Jesus, I believe that we will find Jesus. The shepherds did. Now, we don't always find Jesus in the way that we want. Sometimes we seek Jesus with our own ideas of how this should actually work out in the end. But if we seek Jesus, we will find him. But we think of the shepherd's story, because after they saw him, after they saw Jesus in a manger, they told everybody what had happened and what the angel had told them about this child. All who heard the shepherd's story were astonished. But Mary kept all these things in her heart and thought of them often. Then the shepherds returned to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for everything they'd heard and seen. It was just as the angel had told them. Even today, if someone came and told you this story, so they had this type of experience, however we would say it's similar, you would kind of be like, whoa. Now, you may have suspicion. We're in a kind of a suspicious society, right? You may have some skepticism among you, but you'd be like, wow, that's a crazy story. Now, assuming the story is authentic and you heard it, hopefully you would be moved by Jesus in some ways. You see, following Jesus is not just about being able to articulate the right things. It's not just about being able to understand correct doctrine or the right philosophy or the correct moral stances on certain issues. It's an encounter with Jesus. Some have described it as it's a love story. In many ways, it's an event. But part of what we've done is that we tend to domesticate Jesus. We want Jesus to be safe. We want Jesus to be comfortable. We want Jesus not to call us to do anything that is uncomfortable. We want our preferences to remain intact. We want our desires to be undisturbed. We don't want to be challenged. We don't want to have to break from the ordinary, from the normal, and have our lives disrupted. We want Jesus to be easy. And we know life's not easy, and there's certain ebbs and flows that we go through. And Mary is there with Jesus, and she's soaking everything in. Now, even from the father's perspective, having a child is an overwhelming experience. I can only begin to imagine what it's like for the mother of carrying the child for 9 months and just the emotional connection. But even in this moment, Mary is just soaking this all in. She's receiving all of this. But I think we look at Mary, her obedience throughout all this. We look at her life, how she lived her life. We recognize that these things are bigger than us. But a lot of times what we do is we want Jesus, but Jesus, don't take this area of my life. And you know, we talk about Christmas, you know, we're so busy. We talk about all these gifts that we give, so we're financially stressed. We have all these events with friends and family. So all these things begin to squeeze Jesus out. And we know the answer, that Christmas is not about the gifts. It's not about the parties. It's not about family. We know those things, but it's real easy to idolize those things, to allow those things to push Jesus out. But the gifts are not the good news. Family is not the good news. Events are not the good news. Jesus is the good news. We know that, but it's really hard to live that sometimes. But I want to challenge you, wherever you are in your spiritual journey, to inspect with imagination, to go to Jesus with curiosity of, I know you're worth pursuing. I still have a lot to figure out in my life. No matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you have more to figure out in your spiritual journey with Jesus. But you've discovered that Jesus is worth pursuing. See, our gatherings, like today, they point to the hope that we have in Jesus in the future. Now, we can begin to experience that hope right here, right now. But this hope defies the world because the world does not understand our hope right now. So I don't know what it looks like for you. But I also recognize that this journey is something that's almost impossible to do alone. I come back to my hometown. I could tell you, hey, we got to get to the big park today. You could Google that as much as you want. You're not going to find any reference to the big park. But I can take you to the big park. And so my ability to articulate it may be lacking. But what happens is we gather together not to be able to have the best theological jargon, but to understand who Jesus is, to understand what does it mean to get to the big park. How can we be shaped by that? We understand who Jesus is because we help others come and experience the big park as well. Maybe it's kind of like Sesame Street. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? I may not be able to tell you how to get there, but we can go together. And I can show it to you, not because I have figured it out, but because I have figured out that this Jesus is worth pursuing. That's what we're doing here. We're not here because we've got it all together. Maybe you have it together better than most everybody else. But we're here because we're trying to encounter this Jesus and allowing him to shape us. Because we go out into the world and the world tries to shape us in a certain way. And that's not to speak derogatory towards the world, but that's what everything is trying to do. And Jesus says, just come to me and let me shape you. Come together and we can shape each other and understand who this Jesus is to a greater degree. So I want to encourage you to inspect for Emmanuel with imagination this Christmas season. We've got 8 days until Christmas. It's almost here. We've got a lot of things on our schedule, a lot of things on our calendar, a lot of things to do before we get to Christmas. But don't forget to approach Jesus with curiosity.